All right. I'm here with Alejandro Ganimian of New York University. Ale, you've done a lot of work in education and on school leadership as well. But I wanted to ask you specifically about a paper that you wrote with a few co-authors, Rafael de Hoyas and Peter Holland,
Mhm.
titled Teaching with the Test, Experimental Evidence on Diagnostic Feedback and Capacity Building for Schools in Argentina. So if you could just start by talking me through kind of what the research question was that you were trying to answer and how you kind of went about doing that.
Sure. So I would say the broad question that we were trying to answer is how you can get individuals to change their behavior. In
Mm,
this specific case, the individuals were school principals, and the behavior that we wanted them to adopt is to pay greater attention to the learning levels of their students, which by both international and domestic assessments are quite low.
mm,
So specifically in math and language. I think it's important, though, to note why principals must not pay attention to this in the first place, or not as much attention as we want them to, right? It's not that principals don't care. It's not that they don't know how to, but the job of a principal in Argentina and in many developing countries is structured around administrative responsibilities, right?
mm,
That's not only how they what they're held accountable for, but that's also what they get rewarded for. So it makes only sense that the sort of the priorities of a school principal in Argentina, specifically in the public sector, would be more towards those responsibilities rather than to care about improving student learning, right? So how can we get them to make this transition? And I think another point of context that might be helpful is to understand what was happening in Argentina at the national level at the time. So we started the study in 2013. Argentina has had a national student assessment since 1993.
mm,
And in the years leading to our study, there have been three major changes to the way in which we collected student achievement data. We disseminated that data to schools, which were the federal government had reduced the frequency of those assessments from being every year to every 2 years to then every 3 years. They had passed the national education law a few years before in 2006 that prohibited the dissemination of results at the student level, teacher level, or school level.
mm,
And in 2013, they had discontinued the publication of assessment results even at the province level, which is our equivalent to state. We're also a federal country, much like the US and India, right?
mm.
So I guess I started with a broad framing of our question, which is how do you get individuals to change their behavior? I want to bring it down to reality and make it more specific now. So the question that we were trying to answer is in an information starved school system like Argentina, would informing principals of their students' low performance lead to changes in school management and in classroom instruction? And would principals and teachers need additional support to react to this information? And we can get into the interventions if you want to.
Yeah, could you actually talk us through a little bit the multiple interventions that you guys studied?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we sampled 104 public primary schools in the province of La Rioja, which is a very disadvantaged province in Argentina, where we randomly assigned by lottery schools to one of three groups. One of them we called the diagnostic feedback group, which is a group that received at the beginning of each school year. Our calendar runs from February all the way to November. A school report card, which actually told principals um, the learning levels of their students, not only just in their school, but also as they compare to the average in the province. And it disaggregated these results not just at the school level, but at the section level. This is going to be important because later we're going to talk about sort of why we think this intervention was impactful. And I think part of the reason why was because you knew that, say, section A was doing worse than section B, and so you might want to focus attention on that. And another key component of those report cards were what we call like a traffic light display, which
Mm,
was in each of the topics in both math and language. We disaggregated results by both content and cognitive domains. So let's say in math, You might have numbers and operations, you might have geometry and measurement, you might have data visualization. So in which of those three were students performing best and worst? Which was great to know, right? Because it told principals if something was on green, that they could maybe continue doing what they were doing. And if
Mm.
something was in red or yellow, maybe that they needed to shift strategies or pay greater attention to that topic. So that level of disaggregation, I think, might have been potentially important for both principals and for teachers, which we can get into as well. So
Mm.
that's the first treatment, which is diagnostic feedback. The second treatment, which was capacity building, did exactly the same. But in addition to doing that, we provided principals with professional development workshops throughout the year. So 5, I think, in the first year and 6 in the second one. These professional development workshops were mostly for principals and something that exists in Argentina called school supervisors. These are sort of higher level officials that have a cluster of schools in charge. So similar to a BRC or a CRC in India. Um, and basically they were on not only on understanding the information in the report, because maybe that wasn't happening already, but also on how to transform that into action. So
Mm.
they received a lot of training on how to develop a school improvement plan, which basically identified areas for improvement and then proposed some steps to track them. And in one case, the developers of the intervention chose a specific topic within math achievement, which was geometry, and they trained teachers. But that was a very minor component of this intervention. So that was the second one, which was capacity building, right? And I think it's important, typically this is not important to do, but in this particular RCT, I think it's important to understand what the control group received.
Mm.
So given that the environment in Argentina was what I just explained, which is a very sort of information-starved school system with very infrequent assessment, we actually did not want to assess the control group at baseline, because we thought that if we came into schools and assessed them, then that would potentially trigger behavioral responses from both principals and teachers, right? They might think that they're being monitored and therefore respond differently. So we only assessed that group at the end of the trial. And then with that information, actually, once the study was over, we did provide the reports, because of course they deserve to receive that information as well. But during the entire 2 years of the study, they received nothing else.
I see.
So those were the three groups: the control, information, diagnostic feedback, and then capacity building.
Got it. And can you now, that was very helpful. Can you just talk us through now what the kind of key results were that you found?
Sure. So our most encouraging results were for the first intervention that I described, which was diagnostic feedback, right? So we found impacts on student achievement in the tests that we developed as independent researchers. So we found effects of 0.33 of the standard deviation in math and 0.36 of the standard deviation in reading, which are sort of quite large effects by developing country standards. But you might think the title of the paper is teaching with the test. So maybe what we did is just we trained these kids on how to respond to multiple choice questions, and really no learning really occurred. So in other to address that possibility, what we did is we actually requested the results of the 2016 National Student Assessment, which students took in 6th grade. So those students who took it in 6th grade had gone through 2 years of our intervention, right? And we also found sort of moderate to large impacts there. So we found a 0.26 standard deviation effect in math and a 0.22 standard deviation in reading. Why do I mention this? Because I want to make clear that this wasn't sort of a training students on test taking strategies, but it was rather improving their learning strategies, given that there was no correspondence between the way in which we ask questions in our tests and the way that the national assessment does it, right? This was also a slightly modified version of the national assessment, so we can be quite certain that there wasn't coaching involved, right? So that might be sort of the most important part for everyone else, but for school leadership organizations, what I find most interested in is that school principals started using information on student achievement for different decisions.
Mm.
So some of them were reporting that they were looking at this information. Others were reporting that they were looking at this information as it pertained to their judgments about teacher effectiveness. Some of them even said that they were being evaluated potentially by supervisors based on this information. Um, and they were using it for many reasons. Interestingly, though, not to assign students to different classrooms, right? So precisely they were using it how we wanted them to. But then a big question for any school management intervention is, all right, you've got the principals. The principals are responding how you want them to, but nothing is going to change in terms of student achievement if that change doesn't move into the classroom, right? So were teachers responding to that intervention as well? We found that they were. And we weren't trusting what teachers were telling us, although we could have done that as well. We asked students,
Mm.
when you ask questions, is your teacher friendly to you, or how many times does your teacher allow you to explain your answers during class, or does your teacher make eye contact with you, or is your teacher friendly to you? And across the board, in 7 domains, which you might be familiar with through the tripod surveys called the seven
Mm.
C's, right? So everything from clarifying difficult content to showing that you care for your students. All across those 7 domains, we found that students were much happier with the teachers that they received. And we also asked them, what kinds of activities did you do in your math and language classroom, right? So we weren't finding that teachers were doing things that you wouldn't think of, but they were doing more of the traditional classwork tasks. So they were assigning more homework, they were assigning more classwork, they were doing more exercises. There was no, as far as students reported, coaching. So we asked them about that. None of that seemed to happen. So we saw the entire causal chain at play, right? So we saw changes in school management, we saw changes in classroom instruction, and accordingly, we saw changes in student achievement. Now, the big enigma of this paper was, what about information plus capacity
Right.
building? And that didn't work. That didn't work as we expected. So the effects of capacity building plus information were just as good as the effects of information alone. And that might be for a number of reasons. It could be entirely possible that principals and teachers already knew what to do once they received the information, and the limitation was that they weren't receiving that
Mm.
information. So once you gave them that, they just rolled with it, right? But also, I think two important aspects to highlight is that the schools that we randomly assigned to this capacity building group were starting from slightly lower levels, so maybe that had something to do with it. And also, the demand for these traditional style workshops that the government and the NGO that we had contracted were offering was the attendance for it was quite low, right? So
Mm.
it could be that they just weren't sort of taking up the treatment as much as we wanted them to. So therefore, it's not surprising that this capacity building component didn't have a value added that we wanted.
Got it.
Yeah.
You started answering this a little bit, but I'd be curious to
Mhm.
hear what you think the implications for your work are for organizations like GSL that work with school leaders. And I'm not sure if this was in the kind of the remit of your paper, but just seems like this intervention occurred at multiple levels, like with districts, like with at the district level with the school
Mhm.
leaders, and then of course the
Mhm.
teachers also got some information. So if there's any way to kind of disaggregate or understand what was actually the role of the principal in some of the
Hmm.
gains that you saw compared to the other layers or um,
Yeah.
things of that
So
sort.
let me start with that second one, which is easier, just because I don't know that there's much that we can say about that, right? So
Mhm.
the target person for the intervention was the school principal, and
Mhm.
we actually did not require the principals, although we highly recommended that they share that information with teachers. It was quite surprising, at least to me personally, that they did so frequently, because otherwise we wouldn't have seen teachers make the changes in classroom instruction that we did. So, but beyond that, it's not like we can sort of like distinguish between, say, the what influence was coming from the supervisors versus the principals.
Mhm.
We tried to do that, but the challenge was that some of the supervisors have schools that are in the control group and some schools that are in the treatment groups, and either one of them. So, nothing prevents them really from taking the lessons that they learn from a treatment school and implementing them in a control school, right?
Mhm.
That's not what they were supposed to do, but we couldn't really discard that possibility. So unfortunately, there's not much we can say about that. But in terms of implications, I think there's maybe two sets of implications. There's direct implications from the work that we have done in this paper, and then there's indirect implications of the work that we haven't
Okay.
done in terms of sort of what are the pending questions, right? Which I think organizations like yours can help with. So, in terms of the direct implications, they're very straightforward as far as I'm concerned. So, you might want to inform principals of the learning levels of students in their schools. You might think that they know, but actually increasing evidence suggests that not even teachers are very accurate in terms of their perceptions of their students' learning levels. You might want to disaggregate those results as much as possible. That will help both the principals and teachers pinpoint gaps in learning. So I was referring before to the differences between class sections, but also the differences between topics within a subject or skills within a
Mm,
subject. You might want to encourage them to discuss this with teachers, right? So never stop at the principal level. Make sure that there's that sort of like second stage of the intervention, because unless something changes at the classroom level, there's not going to be any impact in terms of student achievement.
mm,
And then I would say check whether they need the support to know what to do with those results, right? So I would say ask but verify. So you might want to ask them, let them implement their preferred changes. And if those changes don't make an impact, then try to see what type of support would be helpful for them. I don't think that traditional workshop style professional development sessions were maybe the most optimal
mhm.
use of their time or our time. So maybe innovating along those dimensions, and your organization does that very well, might be the way to go. And then in terms of indirect implications of the work that we haven't done, we just know incredibly little about what factors we have to take into consideration when we recruit principals, what factors we might want to use as predictors of principal performance when we select principals, how much, for how long and what dimensions should we observe of principals in their first years on the job to understand whether they're going to succeed in that position or not. So I think, collecting data on both the different types of approaches that you can take to recruitment, where you recruit people from, then keeping really close track of not only the academic credentials and experience of the teachers who want to become principals, but also of their subject matter expertise, also of their understanding of social emotional skill development for children, potentially even of the way in which they lead groups and work with others, right? So you might want to have sometimes clinical assessments to understand those skills that principals might hold, and then of course observations of principals on their first year of the job can be incredibly helpful to provide descriptive information to generate hypotheses about what might matter, so that you both inform your program development, and also you inform global knowledge and what matters for school principals, to potentially give ideas to researchers like me about
Mhm.
what types of interventions to try out next, right? It is shocking to me that we have known for a very long time that the principal is the second most important factor in determining a student's learning level after teachers, and yet the research is so lopsided towards teacher recruitment, teacher selection, teacher evaluation, so on and so forth. And we really, really, at least in developing countries, have very little to go by in terms of rigorous, and by rigorous I mean experimental, quasi-experimental evidence on what works to improve the capacities of school principals.
Mm. Great. Well, I think that's a very future forward note to end on. So thank you, Ale, for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right.